Hi, my name is Jeffrey Smith, and I'm with the Institute for Responsible Technology, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Stephanie Seneff. Dr. Seneff is a senior research scientist at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Now, you may remember from a previous interview, we interviewed Dr. Seneff about an article that she and Anthony Samsel did on glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup. And that particular article was really a pivotal article, and it linked glyphosate with heart disease, cancer, obesity, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, autism, aggression, depression, anorexia nervosa. Did I miss anything?
That's a good list. I'm sure you did, though. There's so many. But that sounds good.
So now you have come up with a new article on gluten-related disorders and glyphosate. Now, actually, I published an article, and you were a research support person on that back in the fall of 2013, and you said, I can't give you everything that I have on this because Anthony and I are going to be publishing an article on this. And I said, great. And now that I've seen the article and read it, I'm so glad you didn't give it to me, that it's actually now in a peer-reviewed published study. So first of all, thank you for doing this research on glyphosate. But now that we're focusing on gluten-related disorders, perhaps you could start by giving, and I know some of the people watching this have gluten-related disorders, but others don't know what it is. Why don't you start by telling the audience what a gluten-related disorder is, how prevalent it is, and why some people should be concerned?
Yes, well, it's a sensitivity to gluten, which is found in wheat, and so people can't eat wheat-based products as a consequence. And in the extreme case, with celiac disease, it's also associated with antibodies to an enzyme that's called transglutaminase, and that enzyme forms many important roles in the body. It's involved in reproduction and fertilization, for example, and it's involved in maintaining healthy blood and blood clots. So there's many ways in which having an immune reaction to transglutaminase is a very bad idea. So it has a lot of consequences.
Well, let me stop you right there and see if I can hone in on this for those people that don't know what an antibody response means and why this is a bad thing. So you eat wheat, it contains certain proteins like gluten and certain types of glutens, and then for some reason the body reacts to that. And when it reacts to that, it starts to inform the immune system, this is a bad thing, attack it. And so it takes a mugshot of the gluten molecule and circulates it to all the post office walls in the body, and says, attack that. But actually what the immune system starts to attack is not just the gluten, but attacks something that's natural to the body called transglutaminase. Is that right?
And that enzyme is involved in breaking down the gluten, but it gets messed up when it tries to break down the gluten, and it gets combined with the gluten, and the whole thing becomes immunoreactive.
I see. So then that's called an autoimmune disease, right? Because the immune system starts to attack itself, thinking that it's attacking a foreign invader.
Right.
All right. So so celiac is the most intense form of gluten-related disorders.
Yes.
And I've heard some pretty serious impacts in the article that I wrote, which is at glutenandgmos.com, and we'll link this there as well. Yes. That undiagnosed celiac disease is related to a 4-fold increase in risk of death.
That's right.
What are some of the characteristics, symptoms of gluten-related disorders, including celiac?
A lot of digestive problems, certainly with things like diarrhea and indigestion. But then beyond that, there are an amazing number of other factors that enter into the problem. Because of the transglutaminase and how essential that is for many roles in the body, you get into things like infertility problems. They've shown connections with things like having deformed children, so birth defects, particularly microcephaly and anencephaly, which means small brain or missing brain, a very serious birth defect. And then they also have more problems with their guts. They have increased risk to something called eosinophilic esophagitis, which is a swallowing problem in the esophagus. And they have problems with depression. They have increased risk to cancer, which is the thing that is the main thing that causes early death, and particularly non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
So this is very serious. How prevalent is celiac or gluten-related disorders in the United States?
It's high and increasing. I think, do you know, actually I forget the number now, was it 5% of the population? have some kind of wheat disorder today, which is unbelievable. And it's something that sprung out of nowhere. I mean, I hardly even heard of celiac disease a few years ago. And now you go to the grocery store and routinely there's a huge section selling gluten-free products. So this has really appeared out of nowhere in the last few years.
Is it possible that we're just diagnosing it better, or do you think it's actually on the rise?
Oh, I totally think it's on the rise.
And wasn't there a study where they actually took blood that was
they
frozen?
They looked at blood they had kept from a long time ago, like 3 decades ago or something, and they compared that blood to blood from people taken today and showed that in fact there was a much lower rate of this transglutaminase problem in the earlier blood than there is in blood today.
That's kind of like basically proof that there's actually, so there's something real going on. So there's something new. Now, it could be new in the wheat, or it could be new in other food, or it could be new in the environment. Let's start with the wheat. Is it possible that the wheat is just different than it was 2 or 3 decades ago?
It certainly is, because the wheat has undergone a lot of changes. They've been doing a lot of genetic altering of the wheat and changing the gluten.
But not genetic engineering, just
not
selective
genetic engineering,
breeding.
but just the normal old-fashioned genetic selection process that's changed the quality, changed the wheat protein. So that's possible, and people have argued that that might be the case.
So, but you argue in this article that for some reason glyphosate, or the active ingredient in Roundup, the characteristics that it causes in the body fit hand in glove with this whole array of symptoms that you described. Let me describe what glyphosate is and how it's used, and then I'd like you to take it apart and show the characteristics of this very unique molecule and why it could be wreaking havoc and causing people to have to go to the gluten-free section of the supermarket.
Right.
So glyphosate was originally patented as a chelator, which means it binds with nutrients or binds with minerals, and then it was patented as an herbicide, and then it was patented as an antibiotic. So it's all these 3 different things, and it was patented mostly by Monsanto, which uses it as the main ingredient in Roundup herbicide. Now, Roundup herbicide is the most popular herbicide in the world. It is sprayed on Roundup-ready crops that are genetically engineered not to die when sprayed with Roundup. So soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa are all Roundup ready, and that means that if they were not Roundup ready, they would die if sprayed with Roundup, but they actually absorb the Roundup and store it in the food portion for us to eat. Isn't that exciting? Now, in addition, Roundup is being used as a ripening agent on other crops. So why don't you explain some of the other crops and why Roundup is being sprayed, not just on Roundup-ready food, but other foods?
Right. Well, this is something that we found out in doing our research, and I was quite stunned to see this, that increasingly Roundup is being used right just a few days before the harvest, sprayed on wheat in particular, and other things too, in particular sugarcane, which of course is very common for sugar, and beans, legumes. So there are several different barley, food items that are now being sprayed with Roundup right before the harvest with the intent of killing the plant. So these are not Roundup-ready plants. These are plants that are going to be killed by Roundup. They are killed, but the farmer finds that convenient to sort of get a head start on clearing the field, to kill any weeds that might be coming up for next year's crop, and also sort of causes them to go to seed. As they're dying, they go to seed, so it increases the yield. So this is becoming a very popular thing, and particularly because it's widely viewed that Roundup is harmless to humans, so they think there's no danger in getting the Roundup into the wheat.
So now that we're consuming Roundup in so many of the different foods that we eat, let's dive in and find out what Roundup is doing. Now, in your article, you have a beautiful chart, and the chart describes 4 or 5 different characteristics of Roundup, and I have that chart here. Now, the first of the characteristics is disruption of gut bacteria. Then you have metal chelation, CYP enzyme inhibition, and Shikimate pathway suppression. Now, for the uninitiated, these sound very complicated, but let's go in one at a time and explain why Roundup is so dangerous and might be leading to gluten-related disorders. Let's start with disruption of gut bacteria. So tell us what Roundup does to the gut bacteria on a very specific way, and what the implications of that are for our health.
I mean, it's amazing actually, because Roundup disrupts two critical bacteria that are very important for our health, which is bifidobacteria and lactobacillus. It kills those bacteria preferentially, and it allows pathogens like C. difficile to overgrow. And in fact, exactly that scenario of the reduced of those two important positive bacteria and increased C. difficile is associated with celiac disease. So there's a perfect match there between the celiac symptoms in terms of the gut bacteria and glyphosate's attack on those beneficial bacteria.
So if you end up killing bifidobacteria and lactobacillus, and I know people spend a lot of money to load themselves up with lactobacillus, if you end up killing that off, what are some of the symptoms you might see?
Yes, well, for example, and I have to check my notes here, but the bifidobacteria produce folate, and folate deficiency is associated with celiac disease and causes a lot of problems in terms of excess homocysteine and too little methionine, and a lot of problems following from that with folate deficiency.
So if you do a folate deficiency, you have too little methionine, and what would that do?
Well, that's terrible because methionine is essential for methylation pathways throughout the body, for one thing, and also methionine is important for initiating protein synthesis. So there's huge problems with having too little methionine.
All right, so just methylation pathways throughout the body. What does that mean?
Well, for example, in autism, hypomethylated DNA is known to be associated with autism in the brain, and that will cause a disrupted brain development.
I see. So if without proper methionine, low methionine is not only a characteristic of gluten-related disorders, but also other diseases like autism.
Like autism, yes.
And so the brain functions less effectively.
Right. Well, it gets turned into this autistic kind of brain, which is unable to socialize and has, cognitive difficulties and social impairments.
We talked about autism in the other interviews, so for those that want to hear more about the link between glyphosate and autism, please go there. But coming back to lack of folate, so the methionine was one of them, and then there was another one.
And then there's cobalamin too, which is also produced by these bacteria, and that needs cobalt, which is chelated by glyphosate. It's also chelated by phytate, and phytase is produced by one of these good bacteria to break down phytate. So phytate will chelate iron, cobalt, molybdenum, all these essential nutrients will get chelated and therefore are unavailable by these phytates, which would be broken down by these good bacteria, but they're not there to do it.
Let me pull that one apart. First of all, the chelation thing is absolutely essential, okay? That cobalamin needs cobalt in order to process it. But cobalt is bound with glyphosate. So because it's tied up in a relationship with glyphosate, it doesn't go after anyone else.
Yeah,
so,
and the phytate will do that too. So there's both glyphosate and phytate that are binding these things.
I see. And so it becomes monogamous. It no longer has any relationships with other
Right.
minerals or metals. And the cobalt, by the way, understand, is a really tight juncture with glyphosate. That glyphosate just, for cobalt, it knocks it out. Now that's related to vitamin B12, isn't it?
Absolutely, that is cobalamin. B12 is cobalamin. And of course, B12 deficiency can lead to senility, dementia.
So there's two things. There's the inability of the gut bacteria to produce B12, and there's the inability of the glyphosate the inability of the cobalt to allow it to process.
Right, exactly. Both of those are a problem.
So we've got senility and we've got autism, but we're getting back to gluten-related disorders. Is the lack of B12 associated with gluten-related disorders?
Yes. It's people with gluten disorders have B12 deficiency. It's associated with that disease.
The gluten-related disorders might also be an excess exposure to glyphosate in this case.
Right.
Anything else with the gut bacteria? Because that was the first category on your chart, which I love that chart, by the way.
Right, and of course the bad bacteria overgrowing is the other side of the coin. Also E. coli, which are very present, but they become anaerobic in the presence of glyphosate. And when they're anaerobic, they produce a very nasty metabolite.
So when you say it becomes anaerobic, usually it involves with oxygen, and that's part of the metabolic thing. It breathes oxygen, so to speak. But in the presence of glyphosate, the oxygen is different, and it's a completely different metabolic system. It's completely different, and it has new byproducts, etc. So the byproducts are a gas.
It produces indole, which is actually a derivative of one of these amino acids that glyphosate disrupts the synthesis of. So that might be one of the reasons why the E. coli have to go through this anaerobic pathway. They produce this indole, which causes lots of problems. It causes toxicity to the kidney, so that ends up eventually with kidney failure, which is also associated with gluten intolerance. And the E. coli are producing this indole, and at the same time, C. difficile are producing another product called P. cresol, which is also similarly, both of these products are related to the pathway that glyphosate disrupts. So they're diversion products because the pathway can't go through.
I see. So
and those diversion products are toxic.
In other words, normally the bacteria are going to produce things that are just fine, but in the presence of glyphosate, they're producing toxins that can mess up the kidneys and be toxic in general.
Right.
Any other problems?
And that are associated with autism as well. So.
Any other problems with the gut bacteria related to glyphosate?
Let's see. I'll check my notes. Well, there's desulfovibrio overgrows, and that's going to cause problems with hydrogen sulfide gas, causing issues there, because excess hydrogen sulfide gas can also be toxic. So desulfovibrio produces this gas that's toxic.
So you're creating a gas as well, and that can be caustic to the intestinal walls?
It's very highly inflammatory, yes. It causes inflammation in the gut.
So now you have inflammatory bowel, which I know is related to gluten-related disorders, having written about that extensively. And you also end up producing a zonulin, don't you, from this overgrowth of gut bacteria, which can then pull apart the cells. You know, it can cause gaps in the cell walls along the intestines, creating leaky gut?
That's right, yes.
All right, so the gut bacteria by itself, it can explain the kidney problems, it can explain the gut inflammation, it can explain the methylation in the brain, it can, a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, the leaky gut, and then of course also the inability to absorb the nutrients correctly as well, because the gut is impaired. So nutrient absorption problems, which are also very clearly associated with celiac disease.
Right. So now the next one is the metal chelation. And this is what glyphosate was originally patented for. It is unique in its ability to bind with so many different metals or nutrients. So talk about specifically what it chelates in relationship to the symptoms we're seeing in gluten-related disorders.
Yes, well, so here on this chart we mentioned cobalt, molybdenum, and iron, all of which are deficient in association with celiac disease, and all of which are known to be chelated by glyphosate.
You know, it's amazing, Stephanie. Every single thing you talk about, it's like, and in the paper throughout, there's all these things associated with gluten-related disorders, and then they're all related to consumption of glyphosate. Now, if glyphosate were taken out of the picture, are there other scientific mechanisms that can explain all these other things, or is this the missing link that we've been waiting for?
I mean, I'm sure there are other things that could be explaining them, but I find it extremely hard to think of anything else that it could explain it so well. Every single thing we looked at, there was a clear connection, and it was easy to connect the dots. We were really astonished at how easy it was to connect the dots on everything with glyphosate, and specifically with glyphosate, which has these specific effects that other things don't have.
So you have then all of these minerals that are now deficient in those with celiac or gluten-related disorders as being perhaps tied up by glyphosate. What's the implications? We talked about some of those. The B12 is very important.
Yeah, we've talked about the B12. The iron, of course, leads to anemia, and anemia is also very strongly associated with celiac disease, and it's a sort of an iron anemia that's intractable in the sense that you supplement with iron and it doesn't take. And that's because the iron's getting chelated by the glyphosate and because it can't absorb through the gut because the gut's broken.
Wow. And any other metals that have...
Yeah, there's other forms of anemia too, macrocytic anemia, which is sort of an inability to produce enough red blood cells, and the red blood cells are oversized, and that's also tied to the glyphosate problem.
Each one of these, okay. Anything else with chelation, or should we go on?
Molybdenum, well, molybdenum inhibits sulfide oxidase. Sulfide oxidase depends on molybdenum, and that's going to produce sulfate from sulfide. Sulfate deficiency is something that I'm deeply involved with. I think sulfate deficiency is behind many modern diseases. And so sulfite oxidase is needed to make sulfate from sulfite. If you can't do that, sulfite is itself toxic. So you produce a toxic chemical that you can't get rid of, sulfite, and you can't produce sulfate, which is something you desperately need, if you don't have enough molybdenum. And this relates to the hydrogen sulfide gas problem as well.
We talked about the sulfate and sulfide in the last interview, but just briefly, suppose you have a deficiency. Can you just list some of the disorders that you think are related to that?
Oh, disorders related to sulfite oxidase? Well, sulfate deficiency, oh my God, just everything. I mean, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, Alzheimer's, autism, gut problems, kidney failure, thyroid failure, thyroid cancer, all the things that are strongly correlated with glyphosate. When you look at the glyphosate application on corn and soy, if you've seen Nancy Swanson's plots, I mean, they're unbelievable. The amazing correlation between glyphosate usage on corn and soy over time and all these diseases which are going up exactly in step with the glyphosate usage. And all of these diseases I can relate to sulfate deficiency. This is something I'm working on steadily to fill in the gaps there, but it's amazing. All of them are connected to sulfate deficiency.
Yeah, I was very impressed with Nancy's work tracking the actual slope of increase of these diseases tied with the slope of increase of the use of glyphosate or the use of Roundup Ready and BT crops or both. And in my work, I end up interviewing hundreds of people after they've removed GMOs from their diet or interviewing their doctors, and it is absolutely predictable that many of these disorders clear up or improve dramatically, often within a few days.
Yes, that's so amazing. That's very gratifying to hear, too, because it means there is a solution out there that's not that hard. You know, just start eating only organic food, which is, of course, what my husband and I are now doing that religiously.
Yeah, I used to say that everyone has to avoid GMOs, but now that glyphosate is sprayed on all of these other grains and fruits and vegetables, it's not quite enough.
Right, right.
So in addition to binding with the minerals and messing up gut bacteria, glyphosate also blocks a particular pathway in the body, a certain system that's designed to detox. So if that gets messed up, then the entire cleaning mechanism, the sanitation engineers, the janitors within the body, no longer have the tools to pick up the stuff. So talk about that.
Now that's just amazing, because when we started looking into cytochrome, these are called Cytochrome P450 enzymes, and you can call them CYP enzymes for short, CYP. Absolutely unbelievable set of enzymes with incredibly important roles in the body. And there are many of them in the liver, and the liver uses these enzymes to pretty much manage all the stuff that's coming in and making sure that it doesn't get into the general circulation, all the bad stuff, you know, make sure that you get rid of all the toxins, you activate the vitamin D, you deactivate the retinoic acid. I mean, there are all these things that are done. You make the bile acids, which allow you to digest the fats. They're all dependent on these CYP enzymes. And when you look at celiac disease dysfunction, you see so many of the problems are associated with CYP enzyme. They can be explained by CYP enzyme dysfunction.
Wow. So this, I mean, the way we've talked about it before is there's, I don't know, 80,000 new chemicals in the circulation. There's so many being produced all the time. We're being exposed to all these different herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, aerosols of all types, and that all of those have the risk of being amplified in their impacts on the body because the body cannot as efficiently remove them. And so they hang out. So in conjunction with other chemicals, toxins, glyphosate could be wreaking havoc hugely because, and the thing is, all these others have a huge number of actions on the body. So if we're amplifying those through consumption of glyphosate, then glyphosate's impact can be universal in terms of affecting every system because it allows these other toxins to be more powerful.
That's right, yes. Everything becomes more toxic because of glyphosate. And I think that's why we're starting to see more effects of things like even acetaminophen, which seems like a fairly innocent thing, can be very toxic if you can't detoxify it in the liver. And that needs CYP enzymes. So vitamin D gets activated in the liver with CYP enzymes. And as you know, we've had a massive increase in vitamin D deficiency in this country in recent years. Now they're prescribing vitamin D supplements to newborns. because they're just finding everybody has vitamin D deficiency. That's the activated vitamin D that they're measuring. And if the liver doesn't have a CYP enzyme that works, you can't activate the vitamin D. So I think that completely explains the vitamin D deficiency.
I mean, vitamin D is absolutely huge. You just Google vitamin D deficiency and people are just throwing out all sorts of diseases and disorders that could be related to that. Now, glyphosate ends up in the cord blood of unborn fetuses by the exposure of glyphosate to the mom who's pregnant. So if there's doing vitamin D supplementation at birth, that could be because of glyphosate exposure in the cord blood.
Right.
Now, what are some of the, we know that gluten-related disorders are linked to vitamin D deficiency.
Yes,
and
they are.
What are some of the symptoms that we see in general for vitamin D deficiency?
Well, you'll have bone issues, of course. You have rickets is well known as associated with vitamin D deficiency. So people having broken bones, elderly people, of course, have huge problems with breaking bones today. And I think that's due to the vitamin D deficiency that's probably being contributed a lot by glyphosate to cause those bone problems. And then vitamin D is associated with all kinds of things as a hormone. There are many vitamin D receptors in the brain, for example, so it's probably tied to things like depression and even perhaps Alzheimer's. I mean, it could be connected to all of these things. Immune system, vitamin D is very, very important for immune function. People are all getting the flu these days. They're getting really nasty colds. These are a consequence of vitamin D deficiency.
Yeah, vitamin D, I've heard about it in so many lectures as I travel and speak at medical conferences. It's quite big.
It's also interesting that vitamin D actually causes the kidney to retain sulfate. So when vitamin D is deficient, the kidney, you lose sulfate through the kidney, and that's how vitamin D contributes directly to the sulfate deficiency problem.
Wow. And that could relate to kidney disease, which we'll talk about before we finish. A very, very sad story I'm going to share, but we'll talk about solutions also at the end. Anything else with the CYP enzymes, or should we go on to the next?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things, but we could probably leave them out. Certainly the bile acids. I mean, the bile acids getting disrupted because you need the CYP enzymes to make the bile acids. You need the bile acids to digest the fats. It really stresses the pancreas when the bile acids aren't working. So you get pancreatitis, which is also associated with celiac disease.
And if you have trouble with the pancreas, is it possible that it predisposes someone towards diabetes?
Diabetes, yes, and pancreatic cancer, of course, both of which correlate very strongly with glyphosate usage on corn and soy.
Wow, that's very serious. Now, the last category you have of glyphosate is the Shikimate pathway. Now, the biotech industry brags, well, the reason why glyphosate kills plants is it blocks the Shikimate pathway, but you don't have to worry your little heads about it because you don't have one. So it's not going to mess up your Shikimate pathway, just the weeds. Can you respond to that comment?
Yes, that's quite an amazing story. And they're right, the human cells don't have a Shikimate pathway. That's why we depend upon our diet and our gut bacteria to produce the critical products that are produced by the Shikimate pathway. And these are the aromatic amino acids. These amino acids are essential because we can't make them. We can't make them because we don't have that pathway. So the gut bacteria are making them for us, and these are incredibly important for neurotransmitters in particular, and also for thyroid hormone. So basically, thyroid's going to get in trouble, the brain's going to get in trouble. You'll have things like depression and violence and autism and Alzheimer's, all of which are associated with serotonin deficiency. Serotonin, it comes from one of those 3 aromatic amino acids that depend on the Shikimate pathway.
Which is tryptophan. It's tryptophan, isn't it?
Yeah, tryptophan, that's right. Tryptophan goes to serotonin and dopamine and melatonin. Melatonin, of course, is for sleep, and we have huge numbers of sleep disorder problems in this country today due to melatonin deficiency, which again comes from that Shikimate pathway. And then tyrosine goes to thyroid hormone, and so we have a problem with thyroid hormone production because of that.
It's interesting that, it's such an interesting way that Monsanto looks through these blinders. It says, we don't have a Shikimate pathway, but it forgets that our gut bacteria have Shikimate pathways, and that's absolutely essential for brain health, thyroid health, brain, all this, mood, etc. Now, let's talk about gluten-related disorders. Do gluten-related disorders, are they related to the problems with the thyroid, the problems with serotonin, melatonin, sleep disorders, depression, etc.?
All of them. All of them are tied to celiac disease. It's quite amazing. And serotonin, so serotonin is actually overproduced in the celiac gut in response to tryptophan. So if you eat something like a banana that has tryptophan in it, or even wheat, for example, has tryptophan, if you eat these foods with tryptophan, your gut becomes super, super keen to make serotonin out of that tryptophan because you're desperate for serotonin. You're so desperate for it that it just goes, it has really super sensitive, makes too much, because serotonin controls the gut movement in the bowels. So when you make too much, all of a sudden you've got diarrhea. So you're sort of stuck with constipation when there isn't enough. All of a sudden there's an excess and you've got diarrhea. So you get these kinds of instabilities in your digestive system.
You know, when I was reading your paper, Stephanie, I was amazed at how brilliant the body is, that it's deprived of something, and so it'll jump on something else as an opportunistic way. So, you know, without tryptophan being produced by the gut bacteria, there's this huge starvation in the body, and as soon as the banana is eaten, it'll cause a very fast, super efficient, too efficient production of serotonin, and it'll be able to handle, it'll risk the diarrhea because the lack of serotonin is too important. So it's like it's saying, I'll accept these side effects because the serotonin requirement is more important than you're feeling comfortable in your gut, in your bowel.
That's right, yes.
And this happens a few times. If you look at that paper, which is brilliant, it's like your body gets deficient of something and it'll jump all over something else while it's there and what's needed. So it'll rearrange because it's not getting it here. Fantastic.
Yeah, the body's amazing. I've been totally fascinated by what I've learned about how the body works, and I'm very impressed with its ability to try to find workarounds, but there's a limit to how much you can do, you know, when you've got this kind of deficiency everywhere. It's amazing the body functions at all, you know, with all these problems.
So we've looked at all sorts of symptoms related to gluten reactions, certain organs, predispositions for certain diseases, gut bacteria problems, digestive problems, certainly. Are there any gluten-related disorders, symptoms that you came across that you did not find a link to glyphosate for?
Nothing. Everything we tried, there it was. I mean, it was incredible, really. Nothing.
Really? Because I mean, I was actually hoping for something that we could blame on the wheat protein by itself.
We could explain everything based on glyphosate. It was amazing.
So gluten reactivity may be, as we said, overexposure to glyphosate and this whole nexus of things that come on. Now, I haven't done a lot of biochemical work in my work on GMOs, but what I get from glyphosate is that it has a unique set of characteristics that set it apart from everything else out there. Would you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. It is a really unique poison, and it has these, because of this complex, you know, combination of attack. I haven't mentioned so much about the disruption of the sterols, but it really messes up the whole sterol system. Sterols, of course, you start with cholesterol, you produce vitamin D, and I have mentioned vitamin D, and all these other, the sex hormones. So the sex hormones get messed up.
You got my attention, go ahead.
Yeah, aromatase, for example, which converts testosterone to estrogen, is a CYP enzyme. So then you end up with too much testosterone, and that's, I think, contributing to the autism epidemic. So, I mean, everything is so messed up. The steroid hormones and all the neurotransmitters, and then, of course, the gut bacteria. I mean, it's a wonder that we work at all when we're exposed to glyphosate.
You know, I was talking to Dr. Seralini, who did this famous study on feeding rats either Roundup Ready corn or the glyphosate, or a combination of the two. It was actually a full Roundup. And he said the female rats had an excess of testosterone and the male rats had an excess of estrogen. He says that that's actually happening in society where there's a compromising of the hormonal balance.
Yes. Well, atrazine, of course, also messes up the hormones, and I think it's causing a lot of. Well, you know that I'm sure you know about Tyrone Hayes.
Oh yeah. Don't get me started.
Yeah, I mean that's so interesting because he's following atrazine the same as I'm following. These are both herbicides, so we think of them as, oh, they kill plants. So what could they do to us? No harm, right? And it's just not true. I mean, herbicides are general biocides, And they cause amazing problems in animals as well as plants. And we need to wake up and realize that. We can't just substitute some other herbicide for one of these that isn't working. We have to get them all out of the system, all the herbicides.
Now, before we finish, you actually threw something in to your paper at the end that was related but oddly different. I remember emailing you and Anthony some months ago and saying, have you seen this? And what this meant was a link to a story of massive deaths in Central America among workers who are working on the sugarcane plantations. And they were dying from kidney failure. And in some populations, 25% death rate. And they use glyphosate as a desiccant, as a ripening agent. And, you know, it had a lot of the characteristics in my first glance, and I was thinking this could be huge. I talked to Dr. Huber about it. He was visiting a plantation, and he was very concerned and saw the link. What did you find when you looked at the characteristics of kidney failure in these areas and the use of glyphosate?
Well, you know there's a paper out. You must know about the paper from Sri Lanka. Amazing paper, which I've read. I've just read it very recently.
Just came out. Yeah.
Yes, it's really exciting because especially because it links to something I've been thinking. It's related. So they identified arsenic plus glyphosate. So arsenic is a mineral that binds to glyphosate. It gets chelated by glyphosate. And through that chelation process, it actually it's hiding in a cage, and it goes right straight past the liver and straight to the kidney. The liver usually would try to detoxify. It detoxifies everything. But the arsenic doesn't get picked up by the liver. This is the theory that they talk about in the paper, because it's hiding inside the glyphosate. So both the glyphosate and the arsenic get into the general circulation, make their way to the kidney, and clobber it. When they get into the kidney, it's an acidic environment, and that causes the two to separate. And so then both toxic chemicals are now ready to go and do their damage specifically to the kidney. Because these people are very, very unusual in that they don't have the risk factors for kidney failure. They don't have the diabetes, they don't have the high blood pressure. They just have the kidney failure. So it looks like toxic poisoning all by itself with none of the sort of history. You know, it's happening way too quickly.
So in addition to all of its other characteristics, glyphosate is a smuggler.
Yes.
It smuggles poisons into organs that would never normally get that poison.
That's right.
And the acidic value, the acidic nature of the kidneys. So it goes in, it's bind, it says, no, nothing happening here, look the other way. It gets into the kidney and it breaks apart from the arsenic, and now you have two poisons
attacking the kidney, yeah. So really interesting. And I think the same thing happens with aluminum. I had already been thinking this before I saw this paper. This is why I'm very excited. I even started to write a new paper where I was writing about the glyphosate carrying the aluminum past the kidney, past the liver, and into the general circulation, and then getting the aluminum into the brain, and particularly into the pineal gland, and causing autism. So I think that's a key factor in autism. Aluminum contamination, and of course glyphosate, God knows what it would do to the pineal gland. But it gets the aluminum into the pineal gland and causes disruption there. So I think, and of course the aluminum will also mess up the kidney. So I think glyphosate is making aluminum much more toxic than it would otherwise be, and it's making arsenic much more toxic than it would otherwise be. And the wheat, now we wrote in our paper about the wheat having an increased risk of arsenic in the no-till agriculture. So no-till agriculture is a consequence of not having to kill the weeds, not having to get rid of the weeds. You just leave the ground alone and just plant. And that increases, the no-till agriculture increases the arsenic in the wheat while reducing the selenium. And the selenium is also really important for the thyroid. So you get into thyroid troubles without the selenium. You get into toxicity with the arsenic in the wheat, and then you have the glyphosate to carry the arsenic right on in.
So that the audience understands, no-till agriculture means you don't plow the field. You don't turn over the soil in order to bury the crops there. You don't need to deal with that in order to weed, because you just spray Roundup, it kills all the weeds, and so there's no need to turn over the soil. And I had no idea until you pointed this out, the biochemical risks associated with no-till for the increased potential for arsenic and the reduction in selenium. I have a question. I talked to a scientist, veterinarian, who says every time he eats something with genetically engineered corn, for example, his urine ends up producing protein, which is dangerous for kidney disease, and he takes it out and he can see there's a difference in the urine. Is that something that would be directly related to glyphosate?
Directly related, because you get protein leakage out of the kidney as a consequence. It's a direct symptom, really, of the kidney failure. It's directly connected.
So I have a couple of questions now that I'm sure people are wanting to hear about avoiding genetically engineered foods and avoiding glyphosate.
I'll tell you one thing you can do. You can move to El Salvador or to Sri Lanka, because both of those places have now banned glyphosate at the country level. I am so thrilled by that. 2 countries have banned glyphosate. We need the rest of them to follow suit.
Okay.
I don't know how many centuries it'll take, but
we're chartering a plane. We're buying up land. We're going to get a glyphosate-free development for you and your family. For those who have less tendency to travel, what do you recommend? And I think you said it before, but just because now we're at the end and people are like, they've gone through a certain level of physiological exhaustion. Their every biochemical pathway of their body feels like it's been violated by glyphosate. Now they're ready to hear. So what do people do?
I mean, the solution is very simple, which is to eat only organic foods, whole organic foods. This is what we do. We're fortunate to have a Whole Foods market close to our house. And Whole Foods has been really increasing their choices on organic products. It's quite refreshing to see that now, a long wall of completely organic vegetables. And you can get pretty much everything. There's certain things are hard to find, but for the most part, you can pretty much eat your normal foods organically by just choosing the organic product. And I think that's absolutely essential. You will notice an improvement in your health, and you will be assured of protecting yourself from awful things in the future, like kidney failure and Alzheimer's disease. What would be the reason not to do that,
There's also community-supported agriculture, where you buy a share in a farmer's field. You make sure he doesn't use glyphosate. There's farmers markets, but just because something is sold in a farmer's market or in Whole Foods does not necessarily mean that it's organic or that it's produced with organic practices. So you have to ask.
You have to see the certified organic, and you have to ask. And we go to farmers markets. We spent some time in Hawaii, and we love the farmers markets there. And they're very honest with us, and they'll say, oh, these 2 are organic, but this one over here, sorry, it's not. So we buy the organic ones, so it's great. I love the farmers markets. I think they're great. And of course, if people have some land and have an inclination, they could grow their own food. And I think that would be the very best. We may need to do that in the short term, because I think once the message gets out, there's going to be such a demand for organic that it may get hard to find.
So get the seeds now.
Get the seeds, plant the seeds, grow the crops, make your own food. I mean, we may need to do that, I think, in the short term. We'll find all these vegetable gardens in everybody's yard, But
now, for someone who's been eating glyphosate, they have a problem with lactobacillus and bifidobacteria and selenium and arsenic and cobalt or B12, vitamin D. They have all sorts of things that may be going wrong because of the glyphosate, maybe. Do you have a list of supplements that you would recommend for someone, or would you recommend for evaluation by researchers in order to create a recommendation? And what would that list be to compensate for the problems?
Yes, I think in the short term you might need to boost some things up. I believe in eating in getting all of your nutrition from food if you can, but when you're in a situation where you've got major deficiencies, you may need to take supplements to get yourself back on board. And certainly the probiotics is a good place to start. Get rid of the glyphosate, take the probiotics to help to get your gut bacteria growing again. So you can do that for supplements. And then, of course, eating then foods like that are fermented foods is a nice way also to get. And lactate is actually a really nice fuel. Doesn't have the complexity of glucose in terms of digestion. Good source of energy. And then if you have the live culture.
Are you talking about the gut bacteria first and foremost?
That's a place to start, is just to fix the gut bacteria, because once you fix them, lots of other things will fix. I mean, you've got to get your gut working in order to be able to absorb. So you could take iron, but it'll just go straight through if you have an absorption problem. It won't stick. So, you want to worry about all these micronutrients, but it's also dangerous to take too much of one and not take the others. So you've got all these different minerals, molybdenum and iron and cobalt and all these things that are deficient, zinc, for example, that are deficient. But taking them as a supplement, I'm not sure, because I think you'd be much better off to eat the foods that contain them. And this would mean eating, for example, seafood, oysters, and all the shellfish, mussels and oysters and clams and scallops. These are all really high in micronutrients, and they have these various minerals. Things from the sea, because the sea, in fact, sea salt also. Switch to sea salt from table salt, for sure. And that'll get you a lot of natural minerals in the salt. And then things like bone broth. So buying bones, cooking them in water, you get the nutrients out of the marrow. And the marrow, again, can replenish some of these. So I like to do things sort of closer to natural rather than just buying some zinc or something and taking it, which is much trickier to do because you could get imbalances in the ones you didn't take, And then sulfur, of course, is the one I think is critically deficient in the modern lifestyle. I didn't talk so much about that this time. I did mention sulfate. Sulfate comes from sulfur. It's sulfur and oxygen. And sulfur deficiency is huge in our food. It doesn't have a minimum daily requirement. So if you buy a box of cereal with 100% of everything, it's not going to have sulfur because it's not required. They're missing it. And it's depleted in the soils, in part because of glyphosate, in part because of the chemical fertilizers. And so to get sulfur, you have to eat sulfur-containing foods, which again includes the seafoods, the fish, the meats, eggs. Eggs are a really good source. So high-quality eggs, never caged chickens, organic, eggs. Really, really good choice. Not very expensive. Eating eggs. And liver would be great, the organ meats, if they were healthy. But of course, the animals today are so toxic that the liver is going to be full of all kinds of toxins. So you'd have to be sure that cow had a good life before you could eat its liver.
You don't want to eat a boozing cow's liver.
That's right.
Well, Stephanie, I want to say I deeply appreciate the work that you do with Anthony Samsel in these papers. I know Anthony was a real pioneer. We'll have an interview with him shortly. And there's some stories he has that are just amazing that I want to share with everyone.
He's amazing. I'm so glad to have met him. And I should say the history of myself, it was only a year ago, September, that I first got aware of glyphosate. It's not something you pick up on because it's supposed to be so innocent. But Dr. Huber, who's an expert on glyphosate in plant pathology. He's a professor, a retired professor from Purdue, and he gave a 2-hour talk, which got me introduced to glyphosate. And then Dr. Mercola tipped me off on Anthony, and I corresponded with Anthony, and Anthony and I immediately started a total love in. I mean, we were just poring over all these papers and eating it up, and just trying to figure out what story can we tell next. And we're still gonna. I mean, we're very actively involved to this day. More will come.
I imagine it was a full-on biochemical geek fest.
It's amazing. It was just so amazing and such an eye-opener. And I had been looking for the cause of autism for so long. When I heard Don Huber's talk, I realized I had come home. I mean, I didn't need to look any further. I think glyphosate is by far the most important factor in autism. We need to get it, out of the food. We need to get it out of the country, really. We need to ban it. I hope that will happen eventually. But in the meantime, people can take individual choice, make individual choice and make a difference, one at a time.
Well, I want to thank you for being one of the spokespeople about why we need to make a change in our agriculture, in our diet, etc. And I think this is a very good early step in that. I won't say first step because we're further along than first step. And I think a lot of people, there's millions of people avoiding GMOs, for example. 39% of Americans say that they're reducing or avoiding GMOs as of last year. That's up from 15%.
That's a great number.
Yeah, huge number, up from 15% in 2007. And I'll look forward to speaking with you and interviewing you after you've done future articles relating glyphosate with other diseases.
We will, and I thank you so much for the work you've done for so many years. I'm so appreciative of the efforts and the difference you've made in getting people informed about this really important issue. So,
Thank you.
thank you.